In this episode of the Khizr Studio podcast, I'm in conversation with Dr Christopher Cowell, an architectural historian and lecturer at London South Bank University, and we talk about all sorts of things. Hope you enjoy it.
I'm the only full-time member of staff who kind of self-identifies as a historian, you know? And Jez laughs about this because she says, when we come up onto the things, and she says, remember how Chris identified himself? She says to the students, the dissertation. But it's like, yeah, I'm a trained architect, I'm a trained historian, and I'm a trained architectural historian. And so all three, I have degrees in all three separately.
Wow.
And it's a journey. I had no idea I would be a historian. I was just an architect, and just by chance I ended up writing. I enjoy writing, and I guess like the Dune thing, I enjoy creating, designing with history, so that history is a form of discovery. And so I guess, you know, I would be interviewed. I don't know if this is interviewing now, but
it is. We're rolling. Yeah. I think it's like the idea of history. The thing that always fascinated me as well about history is that you're immersing yourself in a world, right?
Yeah.
And there's something. I remember when I was younger, there was something quite, it sounds kind of crass to say, but something quite evocative about the world wars, you know, and the outdated technology and the way that people used to think. And I don't know, like, and obviously you watch a lot of films and it's to some degree romanticized, you know, that period. I think we always do that maybe, you know, we always romanticize the past. Is that something that you find, how do you see that in history? Do you think that is something that pulls you towards it? Because
romantic side?
No, the kind of the fact that you get the chance to immerse yourself in another world, which because obviously given the work you've done with your book that you've just published, Chris, and you know, we were talking about Dune earlier, you know, the whole idea of kind of world building. Do you think that's where your interest lies with history, or is it something completely different?
I think there's definitely a side to the world building. To me, it's not about playing God. It's not like being Frank Herbert and writing Dune, and I think even Frank Herbert, I imagine there's a degree of, you can tell with Frank Herbert, there's a degree of kind of scholarly historical sleuthing, which he then alters and reframes in a completely different radical environment. So you can tell that he studied, for example, Muslim crusades and things like that. You could tell that he studied some elements of the Jesuits, whereas the Bene Gesserit comes out of that word. We learned that in one of his later books. So there's a kind of component building that he's doing, eclectic bricolage, you know. And I think for me, that's not quite like that, because I start off not knowing what I'm going to find. But I've learned, one of the wonderful things is I've learnt how to not feel you need a safety net, but rather just throw yourself into this, what seems to be a scary situation where you're asking a question of a period. And I think the key thing is to find something no one's done or not talked about, but it's hiding in plain sight. So when I worked on this book on, I don't know if I should say,
of course,
Form Follows Fever,
of course.
Malaria and the Construction of Hong Kong. So when I first wrote about this, I knew that from having done readings that there was very little done on the very first beginnings of Hong Kong. There were presumptions about stuff. And I was going to write about the Royal Engineers, and because I remember reading this article by this guy, John Wheeler, who talked about the Royal Engineers, army architects he called it. And he talked about how they were diaspora, that this really interests me, the weirdness of locality and globality. Maybe that is part of the world making, where something intrinsically odd and uncanny was happening in the 19th century, which was familiar to us as kind of being modern, but also not, also something a bit odd, and also for them. And I think this jarring between the dislocations of the global reach and colonialism and capitalism, these are all phenomena that have tentacles, and they start to form what we now call infrastructure. It's kinds of infrastructure, networks. And these Royal Engineers were strong networked engineers. They had their base here, but they actually then went all over the empire, and they also wrote a journal called the Professional Papers of the Royal Engineers. I discovered this journal. I was fascinated by this intercontinental contact of these people and how they published and wrote and they learnt and they read from each other.
You're talking now about
Royal Engineers.
And you're talking about the provocation of the book.
Yes, of
what
the
comes
book.
later. Okay.
What's leading to it is the fact that as I was going to write about these people in Hong Kong and determine what materials I could find, I kept reading and got saturated in this idea of these medical reports and these doctors. And it turned out that suddenly I realized that a lot of them were fearful of disease and this thing called malaria, which turned out they thought was a gas, malaria, meaning bad air. And so as they were starting to explore this space, and the Royal Engineers, well, engineers were part of it, the Madras engineers and then the Royal Engineers, as they were starting to build roads and build construction and doing public works and stuff like that, they were dying of this, what they thought was this miasma, this, whatever it was, a gas or vapor. And I realized they're starting to talk about architecture and could they rebuild a city that would save them, or could they alter where they are? And I thought, that seems to me much more interesting as a question, much more dramatic and much more powerful, and as an interrogator, something to slice this history with. So one of the things I would say is it isn't just looking about world building, but rather it's trying to find the right storyline to use that pulls that world together as pieces of history. And if you have the right storyline, that all these pieces start to talk together in a surprising way that is immediate and lively and I don't know, powerful and combinative. And so it struck me, it just felt right as I was getting saturated with more and more material. So one of the things is to hold back your inquiry long enough that the evidence starts to talk and starts to tell you what it wants to fall into. And that's a tricky process because you kind of have to not leave it too late, but at the same time you've got to delay the desire to solve something. You've got to almost hold back. This is just my way of doing it, not other people's, but I feel you end up with a much more honest approach, because then the materials give you the real storyline. It's like being a journalist, but you're thrown into the past and you have to solve a murder. And so there's a kind of forensic whodunit quality to it. And then as you're working out the crime and the murder and where the body lay and who you think the protagonists were, then the story starts to fit together, knit around it. And so in this case, the crime is this act of disease that no one can fully identify, and they're constantly trying year by year to solve the paradigm of what's causing their deaths. And as they're trying to solve it, they're rebuilding a city. They start off with one model, which is a linear city that goes all the way along the coastal edge. And then because of malaria killing them on one end and the other, they collapse the city and it goes upwards. And they think by doing that, they can escape the gas plain. So one of the echoes of modern Hong Kong, why we have the peak, mid-levels and the peak on Hong Kong Island, why we have these vertiginous long buildings, is partly, I argue, as a kind of memory, muscle memory of, I describe it as muscle memory of this malarial paradigm of Hong Kong and pulling away from the edge.
That's incredible. And it's your a point on, finding the right story to tell, or the right question to ask to then get that story, to then get to the world building bit.
Yeah.
It's like the world building it is supplementing what is actually quite an honest and quite a precise interrogation of something.
Yeah.
That's so interesting to me, obviously, because of the work I do with architectural storytelling, and it's the peripheral stuff that builds that world. Actually, for it to have any substance, has to come from that story. Has to come from a story, and I think that applies across discipline. Whether you look at film, whether you look at research, writing, architecture, when you're telling the story of a project, it kind of goes across discipline.
Yes.
Because in architecture school, you might have some crazy idea of a project, and what you're trying to do is rationalize it.
Yes.
And what you're doing in that, to rationalize it, is you're communicating what that world looks like in a way.
Yes.
In your project.
Yes. Oh, interesting. I mean, I think that, I mean, it's humorous when I hear people say, oh, well, that's good. That's a very interdisciplinary thing you did, or something. And when I think about it, because it's humorous to me because as I'm a trained historian as well, all historians are intensely interdisciplinary. It's the normal bread and butter of being a historian, is to be constantly thinking of how do I connect this with this with this in all sorts of disciplines. And so I think really good historians, and I don't claim to be one, but really good historians that I admire have an enormous capacity to think about methodologies that are really innovative, and media and sources that you wouldn't think about. So it's kind of like the Annales school, if you know that French school of history, and they're just various. I'm trying to think of this author. I have to look it on my phone. A wonderful historian who I admire, who I kind of, if I can cancel it, I know his name, but it's evaded me. Interesting. Oh, I know it. I knew it before I even found it on the phone. I haven't. It's how it works with phones. You find, and then before you find it, you know the name. Alain Corbin, who wrote The Foul and the Fragrant and Village Bells, and a third book I don't remember. But each book was about a different sense of the body. One was to do with sight, and that was to do with I can't remember the one was Village Bells, which was to do with sound. And The Foul and the Fragrant obviously to do with smell. And so he did different senses. The book on sight was to do, like, I think it was prostitution in Paris or something, and the gaudiness and color and all this stuff. And then another book, Foul and the Fragrant, was in the 80s, it was a very interesting book, and it was about how the pre and post French Revolution, we were more closer together, huddled together. And then when the bourgeoisie took over, we start to distance ourselves and create social space, and the development of perfume to mask our odors comes in, and he starts to look at the history of body odor and the history of perfumery and the history of social separation, and he combines these strange alignments with this simple notion of smell. And it opens with this man who's blindfolded, and he's guided by his helper, and he creates a smell map of the Seine, the river, and he just goes past piece by piece, and he smells it blindly. Why I'm getting to this? The Village Bells is sound, and it's the history of one little town or village in France, and he goes through church records and multiple records. Whereas one is expansive, the other is geographically really tight, but over a much longer time frame. So methodologically, he opposes. One's a shorter time frame over expansive geography, one's a tiny geography over expansive time frame, and you get different things out of it. And he's looking at campanologists and bell ringing, and it creates completely new effects of the idea of the changes of epoch from a religious society to a secular society post-revolution, back into a quasi-religious state, and how the campanology and where the bells rang and how they affected the way this language of this village operated, and how the village, it's remarkable.
Is this in context to the French Revolution as well?
It goes right through hundreds of years.
Oh, okay.
So it's a fascinating thing. And so I only say this in two respects. I want to hear and smell and see my work. So the point of feeling the material is to kind of live in it. And there's a passage where I talk about the sound of Hong Kong, and the sound of bamboo beaters and rats dropping on your head at night when you're sleeping in an inn with drunken and rowdy residents, and all this kind of things, which is eyewitness accounts of how does it feel to be the dynamiting of hills, and the stopping of work on a Sunday. It's all really quiet, and all the Chinese are really annoyed because they lose a day of work, and then they go on strike and all this stuff. So there's this kind of thing about sound and smell and sight and all that. But the other thing is, that's a Corbin take. But the other thing is, it makes me think, juxtapose this book against work I've done in my PhD on colonialism in India, northern India, and the military camps called cantonments or cantonments. And that's a much longer time frame, and the kinds of discourse and material and the way I would approach it and how the evidence talks is very different, because you don't get that kind of breezy narrative, which is all in the book. It's much more almost like reportage. It's almost like a stage play at points. There's conversations between people, and some of it's kind of darkly humorous as well. And I kind of found that I was doing an awful lot more quoting, which kind of like, in some sense, is bad form for a historian to overly quote, because it sounds like a padding, but I wasn't. These were incredible quotations that were really working in this piece, and I kind of, I felt that with the short time frame of just 9 years, it was a really interesting method issue, which is, and this is like, kind of like under the covers or whatever you call it, the back of house question of dealing with method, which historians love to talk about, but no one else seems interested in, which is kind of talking about how do you approach a history of such a tight time frame? What kinds of materials do you use? And in my case, the answer is anything and everything, because you've got such a tight time frame, and it's the beginning of a colony. One of the good things about it is colonial office records start off very small. Like the first year of a colony would be just one volume or small volume, and then the second year it just doubles, and then the third year it's like a little bit of a shelf, and by the fourth year it's the whole shelf. Do you get what I'm saying? So by the time you get 10 years in, the taxonomy of colonial records has become fine-grained, and all sorts of different subheadings and pieces and armatures sit in, say, the National Archives at Kew or the Public Records Office in Hong Kong. And by knowing that, I had an advantage, because even if we're just taking the government stuff, I could find a much more comprehensive, I could read almost everything, and I could quickly scan things and go, this is what I want to stop at. This is what I want to stop at. And so I was thinking about this issue of methodology, and I think I was very lucky that I was able to go through, hoover up as much as I could find. And so in a sense, what has not been written, and one of my colleagues is a Hong Kong historian, said it's very impressive how what we thought didn't have much material turned out to be this large book. So it's kind of like, it shows you can do things by just being a bit dogged about it, I suppose. Yeah. And so it is world making out of force. I'm forced to be world making.
Yes,
to find everything.
Yeah.
So.
And we'll come back to this in a moment. But before if we go back before the book, so what was it that drew you to Hong Kong? What was the interest there? I know that you spent time there. Was that the reason, but even then, like, what drew you to Hong Kong?
So it was an accident. So I lived in Hong Kong by accident, because I had a friend who I was a Bath student in architecture, and her father was running the Arab Associates armature to the office in London. Arab Associates no longer exists now, unfortunately, but it's been absorbed into the Arab family. But I ended up working there as a student in Hong Kong by chance, saying, I wasn't so happy with my job and I wanted to do something else. And she spoke to her father, and the father said, well, why don't you apply to us? We need work, we need people. So I applied. I got an interview at Arab Associates in London, and then I got accepted, and I flew out to Hong Kong, seconded to Hong Kong, and I ended up spending 3 years there, in between the handover, perfectly in between the handover, actually.
Wow.
1.5 years either side of it.
Wow.
97. July.
Did you know this was going to happen? The handover?
No.
Was this in the news at all at the time?
I knew of the handover as a child, because it's really funny. In my head, there were 2 dates that was long in my head for, like, maybe one was longer than the other. One was the 1999 eclipse that would be in Cornwall. I knew I had to be in Cornwall. I did see the eclipse, although it was cloudy. That's a different story. But the other was the 1997 handover of Hong Kong. And it was talked about in the news when I was a child for some reason. And so I always wanted to go to Hong Kong. And all our toys had Hong Kong, made in Hong Kong, everything Hong Kong, plastic things, as I said, Hong Kong. So it was a name a child would know. It's funny. And I kind of remembered this, and it just is fate. I happened to be in Hong Kong working on a railway line, the terminus, the Hong Kong station. And that was my first time in Hong Kong. And I never thought I'd teach there. I was just working as an architect. But one of the professors of university ended up becoming the head of department at Hong Kong University. So he knew me, and I'd left and come back to London. And out of the blue, he called me and he offered me a job to run a master's program, although I had to go through the formal interviewing and all that. But he said, because I was trained as an engineer and an architect at Bath, although I'm not qualified as an engineer, but we did many years of engineering studies as well as architecture. That was the dual, it was like a bit of a dual thing at Bath. And so that's why I ended up at Arup, and that's why they thought I was a good fit there. And I ran this master's program, co-ran it with a guy who was actually the project director, and Greg Pierce, and it was called Master of Interdisciplinary Design and Management, MIDM. And we said, in order to manage the design process, in order to manage the design process, you must first design the management process. And it got me thinking. I'm saying this by way of saying that I started to see design in everything. Even management processes were designed. And I started to think writing is an act of design, an act of creation.